The Wetherspoons Chronicles, Volume 3, The Silence, The Service Dog, and The Storm. Chapter 1, The Sacred Silence of the 7:59. It was precisely 7:55 a.m. on a Friday morning in Gloucester, and the sky had adopted the specific tragic shade of grey usually reserved for a depressed pigeon. Outside the heavy brass-handled front doors of the Sir Lance A. Boyle, the world was entirely devoid of joy. A slight, damp drizzle was falling, not enough to justify an umbrella, but just enough to slowly erode a man's will to live. Standing before these imposing double doors was Ian. Ian was the morning duty manager. He was 58 years of age, possessed a rigidly ironed short-sleeved shirt, and harboured a tightly wound nervous system that operated roughly at the frequency of a disturbed hornet's nest. Ian did not merely open the pub. "Ooh, no, 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 please, let us not be coarse." Ian approached the 8 a.m. unlocking ceremony with the profound, trembling solemnity of a high priest preparing to unseal the tomb of an irritable pharaoh. "Now, listen to me. Let me set the scene." Ian possessed a key ring that weighed approximately 4 pounds. It was a massive, clanking metal halo that hung from his belt loop, threatening to drag his sensible black trousers straight down to his ankles if he turned too quickly. He held the master key aloft. He checked his wristwatch. He checked the sky. He checked the small, huddled congregation of elderly regulars and night shift workers waiting silently on the pavement behind him. They were a pathetic, damp little militia, clutching their folded newspapers, their eyes wide with the desperate, unblinking need for heavily discounted filter coffee. "Patience," Ian whispered to no one in particular, his voice dripping with the sort of theatrical exasperation that could have played the London Palladium. "We open when the clock dictates, not a second before. I am a manager, not a miracle worker. Honestly, the cheek of it. Look at them, like damp penguins." With a sharp, military pivot, Ian thrust the key into the lock. The brass mechanism gave a heavy, satisfying clack. He pushed the heavy wooden doors open, and immediately he was swallowed by the void. You must understand, the Sir Lance A. Boyle at 5 minutes to 8 in the morning was not a pub. It was a sensory vacuum. Because of the sacred, unbending corporate laws of the establishment, there was absolutely no music permitted on the premises until 5:30 p.m. No pop tunes, no generic royalty-free jazz, no radio. Nothing. As Ian stepped inside, the silence hit him like a physical blow. It was the kind of total, suffocating, oppressive quiet you usually only find in a deep-sea submarine or a dentist's waiting room just before they bring out the drill. The building itself was a repurposed 1930s cinema, a cavernous architectural monstrosity boasting high, vaulted Art Deco ceilings. If you looked up, you could almost imagine the elegant ghosts of black and white matinee idols weeping softly at what had become of the stalls. Down below, the floor was covered in the legendary Wetherspoons carpet, a dizzying, violent collision of maroon and gold swirls. It was a carpet that defied physics. It was permanently sticky, possessing a gravitational pull so fierce that if you dropped a coin, it belonged to the carpet now. The pattern was specifically designed to camouflage spilled ale, crushed crisps, and human despair. In the morning gloom, the carpet almost looked like it was breathing. "Morning, Gale," Ian announced, his voice echoing loudly across the empty hall. Standing dead center in the middle of the cavernous room was Gale. Gale was the morning cleaner. She was a woman crafted entirely from industrial bleach and suppressed rage. She stood absolutely motionless, leaning heavily upon her mop, like a Roman gladiator resting upon a trident after a particularly messy battle in the Colosseum. Gale did not speak. Gale rarely spoke. She simply turned her head, fixing Ian with the 1,000-yard stare of a veteran who had seen precisely what the local university rugby society could do to a disabled toilet cubicle on a Wednesday night. She gave him a single, slow, solemn nod. The carpet was clean, or at least as clean as human science would allow. "Right," Ian muttered, clapping his hands together. The sound cracked like a pistol shot in the silence. "Let battle commence." At 8 a.m. precisely, the inner automatic glass doors hissed apart. The morning regulars did not rush. Good heavens, no! Rushing was for the young, the foolish, and people who drank cocktails out of pitchers. The morning crowd oozed into the pub. They shuffled across the threshold with a silent, practiced efficiency, a ballet of orthopedic footwear and damp raincoats. They moved without speaking, fanning out across the vast floor plan, each navigating the maze of bolted-down tables with their eyes closed, making a beeline for their designated, unassigned, yet permanently their booths. First through the breach was Arthur. Arthur was known strictly as the architect. He was a retired local man in a sensible tweed jacket who viewed his morning visit not as a culinary experience, but as a severe engineering challenge. In the absolute, terrifying silence of the pub, the scrape of Arthur pulling out a wooden chair at table 42 sounded like a building collapsing. Arthur sat down. He did not look at the bar. He reached into the inner pocket of his tweed jacket and produced, with the utmost care, a small metal tape measure and a miniature spirit level. He placed them on the sticky varnish of table 42. He then took his knife and fork, polished them meticulously with a napkin, and aligned them in perfect, parallel precision. You see, Arthur used the traditional English breakfast strictly as building materials. Last Tuesday, he had spent 45 minutes carefully stacking black pudding, sausages, and fried bread to construct a surprisingly accurate, scaled-down replica of the Clifton Suspension Bridge. It was a masterpiece of grease and structural integrity, utilizing baked beans exclusively as mortar, though he always had to order the beans on a separate saucer to avoid premature structural degradation from the tomato sauce. He was currently awaiting his canvas, the large vegetarian breakfast, which he fully intended to turn into Stonehenge. Ian watched Arthur measure the table from behind the safety of the main bar. "Look at him," Ian whispered to the nearest condenser fridge, which hummed back in a sympathetic baritone. "He's a lunatic. They're all lunatics. I am managing an asylum with beer taps. Oh well, titter ye not. I suppose it pays the mortgage." And then the automatic doors hissed open once more. The very atmosphere of the Sir Lance A. Boyle seemed to shift. The barometric pressure dropped. The hum of the fridges seemed to stutter. In walked Mrs. Higgins. Now, Mrs. Higgins was approximately 5 feet tall, assuming she was wearing her thickest winter socks, and she had to be somewhere in the region of 85 years old. She wore a floral headscarf tied tight under her chin, a black and white check coat, and an expression of such supreme, withering disapproval that it could curdle milk from 20 paces. She was a woman who had survived the Blitz, decimalization, and the introduction of the Internet, and she was entirely unimpressed by all of them. But it was not Mrs. Higgins that caused Ian's heart to plummet into his sensible shoes. It was her companion. Walking squarely beside her, taking up more square footage than a small family hatchback, was Luna. Luna was an Akita. But to simply call Luna an Akita is to do a grave disservice to the animal kingdom. Luna was a minor deity trapped in a cloud of dense, impossibly mixture of magic colours. The darkness of black, the soft glow of beige, and bright, snowy white fur. She possessed a head the size of a microwave oven, paws that belonged on a grizzly bear, and the sheer stoic dignity of a Victorian statesman. She walked with a slow, purposeful padding sound, click-clack, click-clack, his massive claws clicking against the sticky tiles of the entryway. Ian gripped the edge of the varnished bar. His managerial instincts, honed by decades of corporate training modules, flared into an inferno. The rulebook materialized in his mind, glowing with righteous fire. Section 4, paragraph B. No animals permitted on the premises, with the exception of— "No, no, absolutely not," Ian gasped, abandoning his post at the till and marching out from behind the defensive rampart of the bar. He adjusted his tie. He puffed out his chest. He prepared to be authoritative. He prepared to be the law. "Madam," Ian called out, his voice echoing in the dreadful silence. The other regulars froze. Arthur paused mid-measurement. Gail leaned heavily on her mop, her eyes narrowing. "Madam, I must ask you to halt. Halt right there. Ooh, the absolute cheek of it. You cannot bring a dire wolf into the pub." Mrs. Higgins did not halt. She didn't even blink. She continued her slow, deliberate march toward table 14. Luna padded beside her, her massive tail curling over her back like a furry question mark. Ian practically threw himself into their path. "Listen to me. Read my lips. We have a 5-star food hygiene rating. The area manager would have my head on a pike. You must remove the beast." Mrs. Higgins stopped. She looked up at Ian. Her eyes were tiny, flinty points of pure, concentrated stubbornness. She did not speak. She simply raised one frail, trembling finger and pointed directly at Luna's torso. Ian looked down. Wrapped securely around Luna's massive, barrel-like chest was a custom-fitted, high-visibility neon yellow harness. Woven into the fabric, in bold, undeniable, legally binding black letters, were the words, "Medical Alert Service Dog. Do not disturb." Ian's jaw dropped. He looked at the vest. He looked at the elderly woman. He looked back at the dog. Luna looked up at Ian. The dog's eyes were dark, ancient, and filled with a profound, quiet wisdom. Luna did not bark. She did not growl. She simply stared at Ian with the patient, slightly disappointed expression of a disappointed headmaster waiting for a very slow child to understand a math problem. "Medical alert," Ian sputtered, his authority deflating like a punctured bicycle tire. "Medical? What is she alerting you to? The end of the world? That dog is the size of a sofa. She's not a service animal. She's a form of public transport." Mrs. Higgins simply pushed past him, entirely unfazed. "Come along, Luna. The manager is having a little episode. Don't make eye contact. It only encourages them." Ian stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a landed trout. Well, I never. Of all the outrageous, I ask you, is this fair? Is it?" He turned to the empty room, throwing his hands in the air. "I am highly trained. I have a certificate in conflict resolution, and I am being entirely ignored by an octogenarian and a bear." Mrs. Higgins reached table 14, a prime booth near the window. She slid her tiny frame onto the padded seat. And then, the true absurdity of the morning occurred. Luna, the Akita, did not lie down on the floor. She did not curl up under the table. Instead, with surprising grace for an animal the size of a Shetland pony, Luna hopped up onto the bench opposite Mrs. Higgins. She sat perfectly upright, her massive fluffy back resting against the upholstery, her front paws planted politely on the table edge. She looked straight across the table at Mrs. Higgins, sitting exactly like a fully paying human customer preparing to discuss the morning headlines. The silence in the pub was absolute. It was so quiet you could hear the blood rushing in Ian's ears. Gail, the cleaner, let out a low, raspy chuckle that sounded like rocks grinding in a cement mixer. Defeated, humiliated, and thoroughly outranked by a piece of high-vis fabric, Ian trudged slowly back behind the bar. He rested his forehead against the cold metal of the beer taps. "I yield," he whispered to the San Miguel pump. "The dog has won. The dog has legal standing. I am nothing." Suddenly, the absolute quiet of the pub was shattered by a piercing electronic shriek. "Beep, beep, 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 beep!" Ian jumped out of his skin. He lunged for the electronic Wetherspoons ordering tablet sitting next to the till. The screen was flashing a bright, aggressive green. The ticket machine whirred into life, spitting out a short strip of paper like a mocking tongue. Ian ripped the ticket from the machine. He adjusted his reading glasses. He squinted at the pixelated text in the gloom of the bar. He read it once. He read it twice. He looked over the top of his glasses, across the vast, patterned expanse of the sticky carpet, directly at table 14. Mrs. Higgins had put her smartphone away and was currently wiping the table with a wet wipe. Luna was staring at the kitchen doors with serene expectation. "Order for table 14, Ian read aloud to the empty bar, his voice a hollow, broken shell of the man he had been 10 minutes ago. 1 cup of traditional English breakfast tea and 1 unseasoned Richmond sausage, served on a saucer. Note attached, for the dog. She prefers it cut into thirds." Ian carefully placed the ticket on the stainless steel counter. He closed his eyes. He took a long, deep, shuddering breath, inhaling the faint, lingering aroma of stale beer, bleach, and infinite, unending chaos. "Gail," Ian said softly, not opening his eyes. "Yeah?" Gail grunted from the middle of the room. "The day has officially begun. God help us all." From the far side of the room, the sharp, decisive snick of Arthur the architect snapping his tape measure shut echoed into the void. It was 8:12 a.m. at the Sir Lancer Boyle. The silence was deafening, the carpet was sticky, and the absolute, beautiful madness was only just getting started. Chapter 2. The Prepper and the Puddle. By the time the grandfather clock over the bar, which hadn't actually worked since 2018 but still held a position of tremendous authority, indicated it was 10 o'clock in the morning, the atmosphere outside the Sir Lance A. Boyle had profoundly shifted. Now, listen here and titter ye not, because this is the absolute truth. The sky over Gloucester had turned the exact shade of a violently bruised plum. I know, you're thinking. A purple sky in Gloucestershire? Ooh, he's having us on. But I swear to you, on my mother's best floral teapot, it looked as though the heavens had gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight champion and lost quite badly. It hung low, it hung heavy, it looked positively scandalous. The sort of sky that makes a sensible man tuck his vest into his underpants and reconsider his life choices. Inside the pub, however, the sacred, legally mandated silence still reigned supreme. It was a thick, gelatinous quiet, the kind you could spread on a piece of toast. At table 14, Luna the Akita, who, it must be noted, was a lady of impeccable breeding and absolute decorum, was delicately finishing her unseasoned Richmond sausage. She ate with the measured grace of a dowager duchess, partaking of a particularly fine caviar, taking each third of the sausage into her massive jaws with a polite gentleness that completely defied her bear-like proportions. She did not smack her lips. Ooh, no. She simply swallowed, blinked her ancient, soulful eyes, and returned her gaze to the kitchen doors, awaiting further culinary developments with a serene, feminine dignity. Mrs. Higgins, sitting opposite her, was completing the crossword in the Daily Express using a pen she had stolen from a betting shop in 1994. Over at table 42, Arthur the architect was experiencing a crisis of structural integrity. He had successfully erected the outer henge of his breakfast Stonehenge using tightly packed, overcooked hash browns. But the lintels, constructed from half slices of fried bread, were beginning to sag under the ambient dampness of the room. He was currently trying to buttress the western archway with a remarkably rigid black pudding, his tongue poking out of the corner of his mouth in sheer concentration. If you listened closely, you could hear him whispering equations to a baked bean. Behind the bar, Ian, the morning duty manager, was nursing a cup of tepid water and a bruised ego. He stood absolutely rigid, staring into the middle distance, attempting to manually lower his blood pressure by visualizing a calm, empty spreadsheet. And then the silence was broken. It wasn't a loud noise, mind you. It wasn't a shout or a crash. It was a rustle, a frantic, metallic, synthetic rustling, like a cyborg trying to quietly unwrap a boiled sweet in the back row of a library. Rustle, clack, scuff, rustle. Ian's left eye twitched. He slowly turned his head. There, emerging from the gloom of the back corridor, was a creature burdened by a horrific weight. It was Roxy. Now, let me paint you a picture of DJ Roxy. Roxy was 24 years of age, though her posture suggested she was carrying the weight of an entire medieval diocese. She was the officially contracted Friday night DJ, tasked with the sacred duty of transforming the Sir Lance A. Boyle from a sleepy daytime pub into the aggressively neon, ear-splittingly loud Lloyd's #1 bar exactly at 9 p.m. It was currently 10:05 a.m. She was, conservatively speaking, 11 hours early. Roxy was dressed entirely in black clothing that seemed to consist entirely of zippers that didn't actually open anything. Upon her head sat a pair of oversized, industrial-grade DJ headphones, which were not plugged into any recognizable device, but simply rested around her neck like a highly technological albatross. But it was what she carried in her arms that defied belief. Roxy was grappling with what appeared to be a nest of aggressively angry, black, mechanical anacondas. It was 50 solid feet of intertwined XLR audio cables, extension leads, and power cords, all knotted together in a Gordian nightmare that would have made Alexander the Great weep openly and ask for his mother. She shuffled towards table 8, a large, curved corner booth, dropped the massive tangle of rubberized wire onto the table with a heavy, dead thud, and slid into the booth with a deep, tragic sigh. Ian abandoned his tepid water. He smoothed down his tie, his managerial instincts flaring up like a rash. He marched over to table 8, his sensible shoes squeaking aggressively against the sticky maroon and gold carpet. Roxy, Ian said, his voice a tight, strangled whisper, mindful of the pub's strict morning silence rules. Roxy, my dear girl, it is 10 o'clock in the morning. The milk hasn't even fully settled in the delivery fridge. Why, in the name of all that is holy and administrative, are you here? Roxy did not look up. She was already picking at a particularly stubborn knot of red and black wire with fingernails painted the colour of despair. Ian, she whispered back, her voice trembling with the intense, vibrating energy of a woman who had consumed 4 espresso shots before leaving the house. You don't understand the physics of it. You just don't. The copper, Ian. The copper needs to breathe. Ian stared at her. He looked at the cables. He looked back at Roxy. I beg your pardon. The copper? Ooh, please don't start with the science, Roxy. My heartburn is already playing a symphony. The Lloyd's #1 bar transformation is a delicate acoustic ecosystem, Ian, Roxy explained, her eyes wide, entirely unblinking. Do you think you can just roll out a cable at 8:30, plug it into the mains, and expect a clean bass drop? Nay, Ian, thrice nay. That is how you get feedback. That is how you get a muddy treble. The wires are stressed. Look at them. They've been in my Peugeot all week. They're cramped. They're tense. I have to untangle them now, lay them out flat, and let them acclimatise to the ambient barometric pressure of the room. Ian rubbed his temples. Roxy, I am looking at 50 feet of rubber. It is not a fine claret. It does not need to breathe. And furthermore, you cannot take up a 6-seater booth. What if a large family of tourists arrives? Roxy scoffed, a short, bitter sound. Tourists? In Gloucester? On a Friday morning? Under that sky? Ian, be reasonable. I am doing you a favour. If these cables aren't properly aligned with the magnetic poles of the fruit machines, the 9 p.m. Ibiza mega mix will sound like a flock of geese trapped in a washing machine. Is that what you want, Ian? Geese? Before Ian could construct a suitable rebuttal regarding the company policy on loitering DJs, a new sound entered the pub. It started high above them. The grand, vaulted Art Deco ceiling of the repurposed cinema was vast, plaster-coated, and historically leaky. A single drop of rain fell from the purple sky, plummeting downwards until it struck the grand central glass skylight. To say it made a plink would be an understatement. In the vast, suffocating silence of the pub, the sound of that single drop of water hitting the glass echoed like a dropped grand piano. It was a sharp, dramatic, resonant slap that caused every single person in the room to jump. Arthur the architect flinched, his hand trembling. The structural integrity of his breakfast was compromised. A black pudding buttress slipped, and the western archway of the hash-brown Stonehenge collapsed into a tragic pile of greasy rubble. Arthur let out a soft, heartbroken whimper. At table 14, Luna the Akita simply raised one elegant, fluffy eyebrow, looking at the ceiling with mild, ladylike disapproval, as if the weather had just used entirely inappropriate language in front of her. "Did you hear that?" Roxy gasped, abandoning her cables and gripping the edge of the table. "Did you hear the acoustic resonance?" "It's rain, Roxy," Ian said wearily, looking upward. "We live in England. Water falls from the sky. It is the national pastime. Please just put the cables in the staff room." "No, you don't understand," Roxy hissed, panic rising in her chest. She stood up, looking wildly around the cavernous pub. "The humidity, Ian. The humidity is changing. Do you know what high humidity does to low-frequency sound waves? It dampens the mids. It completely suffocates the vocal track. If the moisture index goes above 60%, my entire UK garage set will sound like it's being played underwater. I should be so lucky, Ian muttered under his breath. Suddenly, the heavens simply tore themselves open. It wasn't a gradual build-up. The bruised purple sky decided it had had quite enough of holding the water up and simply dropped all of it at once. The sound was instantly deafening. It hit the roof of the Sir Lance A. Boyle with the ferocity of 1 billion tiny snare drums. The absolute silence of the morning was violently murdered, replaced by a roaring, rushing, torrential downpour that rattled the single-pane windows and caused the heavy brass doors to shudder in their frames. The pub was plunged into a strange, watery twilight. The gloom deepened. The blinking lights of the fruit machines suddenly seemed incredibly bright, casting frantic, colourful shadows across the sticky carpet. Roxy clamped her hands over her oversized headphones, her eyes darting around the room as if the rain were a personal, targeted attack by a rival DJ. "The acoustics are ruined," she wailed over the din of the rain. "The snare drum is going to sound like a wet cardboard box. I have to re-equalize the entire deck. I have to factor in the barometric drag." She dove back into the booth, furiously attacking the knot of XLR cables like a woman trying to defuse a bomb with her bare hands, muttering dark, incomprehensible warnings about tweeters and subwoofers. Ian backed away slowly. He looked towards the front of the pub. Outside the large glass windows, the high street was rapidly transforming into a moderately paced river. The drains, clogged with the accumulated detritus of modern British life, mostly discarded takeaway wrappers and lost hope, had instantly surrendered. Water was pooling rapidly on the pavement, inching closer and closer to the pub's entrance. At the tables, the breakfast philosophers, the gentlemen who nursed half-pints of bitter and discussed the decline of the local council, stopped talking. They looked at the windows. They looked at the torrential rain. They looked at each other. By a completely silent, unified agreement, a dozen elderly men realized they were not going home anytime soon. A hand shot up from table 9. "Ian!" an elderly man called out, his voice cracking through the sound of the rain. "Better make it a full pint, and a packet of cheese and onion. Looks like we're settling in." Ian felt a cold, dreadful sweat break out on the back of his neck. He looked at Arthur, who was now desperately trying to salvage his breakfast ruins. He looked at Roxy, who was whispering sweet nothings to a copper wire. He looked at Luna, who was sitting perfectly upright, a beacon of fluffy, feminine calm in the centre of the mounting madness. "Gale," Ian said loudly, his voice barely carrying over the torrential drumming on the roof. Gale appeared from the shadows, her mop held at the ready like a spear. "Gale," Ian repeated, his eyes wide. "I think we are about to be besieged. Secure the perimeter, guard the toilets, and whatever you do, don't let Roxy plug anything in." The storm raged outside, the purple sky churning. Inside, the carpet felt stickier than ever. The clock ticked on. It was 10:15 a.m. The day had only just begun, and the absolute glorious farce of the lock-in was officially underway. Chapter 3: The Short Circuit and the Siege. Now, listen to me, and listen closely, because I am about to describe a scene of such unadulterated, catastrophic British panic that it would make the evacuation of Dunkirk look like a mildly disorganized church fete. Don't laugh, I'm being serious. The agony of it all. The The clock above the bar ticked precisely to 11:30 in the morning. Outside the vast, single-pane glass windows of the Sir Lance A. Boyle, the heavens had not merely opened, they had been entirely unzipped by an angry deity with a grudge against Gloucestershire. The rain was no longer falling in drops. Oh, nay, thrice nay! It was descending in solid, aggressive sheets. The High Street, a proud thoroughfare of discount bakeries and mobile phone repair shops, had utterly vanished. In its place ran a churning, muddy tributary of the River Severn. It was a biblical flash flood, the sort of weather event that makes a sensible chap immediately start measuring the dimensions of his garden shed to see if it can comfortably house 2 of every animal. Inside the pub, the tension was thick enough to spread on a piece of Arthur the Architect's structural fried bread. Because, you see, the morning shift at a Wetherspoons is a delicately balanced ecosystem, a fragile truce between 2 completely incompatible demographics. On the left flank, occupying the higher ground near the fruit machines, were the breakfast philosophers. These were the veterans of the sticky carpet, men of a certain age, wearing beige windbreakers and caps, who nursed half-pints of bitter and solved the world's most complex geopolitical problems using nothing but a beer mat and a misplaced sense of confidence. At table 9, Cedric, a man whose eyebrows were so bushy they appeared to be harbouring fugitive moths, was currently explaining to his companion, Barnacle Bill, how the local council was using the heavy rainfall to secretly wash away the fluoride in the tap water. Bill, who had not adjusted his hearing aid since 1998, was nodding sagely and agreeing that, yes, the price of turnips was an absolute disgrace. On the right flank, dominating the lower booths, was the pram-pushing brunch brigade. Now, beware the brunch brigade. These were young mothers, pushed to the absolute ragged edge of human endurance by sleep deprivation and continuous loops of children's television. They did not carry babies. They transported them in what can only be described as tactical, all-terrain infantry vehicles. These strollers were massive, canvas-covered tanks boasting off-road suspension, cup holders, and storage compartments that could comfortably house a medium-sized sheep. The mothers had arranged these strollers into a defensive circle, a wagon train of exhausted femininity, whilst they frantically ingested lukewarm lattes and aggressively buttered tea cakes. In the middle of this Cold War stood Ian, the morning duty manager, vibrating with the sort of nervous energy usually reserved for a chihuahua trapped in a washing machine. "It's rising," Ian whispered, pressing his nose against the condensation-slicked glass of the front window. "Gale, I'm telling you, the water level is rising. It's breached the curb. It's marching toward us. It has intent." Gale, the cleaner, stood behind him, resting her chin on the handle of her mop. She observed the raging torrent outside with the detached, cynical gaze of a woman who had once cleaned up after a stag do from Newcastle. She offered a single, non-committal shrug, implying that unless the floodwaters possessed a decent degreaser, she wasn't particularly interested. And then, the inevitable happened. The muddy floodwater surged across the pavement. It crept under the heavy brass handles of the main entrance. It surged towards the pride and joy of the establishment, the automatic sliding glass doors. Now, the sensor track for these doors was located precisely at floor level, a brilliant piece of architectural design executed by a man who presumably lived in a desert and had never encountered the concept of a puddle. The water hit the electrical track. I wish I could provide you with a dramatic sound effect here. a wonderful explosion, or a heroic crash. But I promised no sound effects, so you will simply have to imagine the noise of a very large metallic sneeze, followed by the dying gasp of a robotic vacuum cleaner. A shower of brilliant, aggressive blue sparks erupted from the floorboards. The automatic doors, caught in a spasm of electrical agony, jerked violently to the left, stuttered violently to the right, and then, with a heavy, deeply final clunk, they slammed shut and fused perfectly together. The locking mechanism engaged with a noise like a bank vault sealing shut for the weekend. The pub plunged into a sudden, horrifying semi-darkness as the main breaker tripped, leaving only the emergency lights and the frantic, blinking neon of the fruit machines to illuminate the sticky carpet. Ian staggered backward, clutching his chest as if he'd been shot. "My doors!" he gasped, his voice cracking by a full octave. "The circuitry! It's gone! We're sealed in! Ooh, the sheer, unadulterated horror of it!" The silence in the pub was profound. The breakfast philosophers paused mid-sip. The brunch brigade stopped chewing their tea cakes. Every eye turned to the fused glass doors, and beyond them, the rising brown water slapping against the glass. The realization washed over the room like a cold bucket of yesterday's dishwater. They were locked down. The pub was a fortress, and they were the unwilling hostages of the Gloucestershire Water Board. At table 8, Roxy the DJ threw her hands up in despair, entirely abandoning her knot of XLR cables. "That's it!" she wailed, pointing an accusatory black-varnished fingernail at the sparking door track. "That electrical surge just magnetized my entire setup. The bass is going to be completely inverted. We are going to be playing reggae in reverse, Ian. Do you hear me? Reverse reggae!" "Roxy, please," Ian begged, gripping his own hair. "My primary concern right now is not the musical fidelity of Sean Paul. We have 70 people trapped in a room with a rapidly dwindling supply of bacon." Over at table 42, Arthur the architect had immediately abandoned his ruined hash-brown Stonehenge. He was now frantically attempting to calculate the structural load-bearing capacity of the front windows using a damp napkin and a piece of Cumberland sausage as a stylus. "If the water level exceeds 3 feet, the glass will buckle," he announced to nobody in particular. "We need to construct a barricade. Bring me all your black puddings. I need dense, compressed meats, quickly." The panic began to bubble. You could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. The breakfast philosophers began to mutter darkly about rationing and the blitz spirit, while the brunch brigade clutched their tactical strollers, their eyes wide with the terrifying realization that they only had 3 organic rice cakes left between them to placate 5 toddlers. Ian knew he had to act. He was the manager. He had a badge with his name on it. He had a certificate in health and safety, level 2. It was his moment to shine. He sprinted behind the bar, his sensible shoes squeaking wildly on the damp floor, and threw open the door to the manager's office. He rummaged through a box of discarded promotional materials, somewhere between the inflatable Guinness hats from St. Patrick's Day 2012 and a box of expired pork scratchings, and retrieved his weapon of mass communication. It was a megaphone, a heavy, yellow, aggressively plastic megaphone that looked as though it had last seen active duty during a 1970s miners' strike. Ian marched back out to the center of the pub, right to the middle of the maroon and gold carpet. He stood tall. He puffed out his chest, ignoring the sharp twinge of sciatica shooting down his left leg. He raised the yellow megaphone to his lips. He pressed the trigger. Now, Ian had not checked the volume dial on the side of the device. If he had, he would have noticed it was cranked entirely to maximum agony. Furthermore, Ian was standing far too close to Roxy's tangled pile of audio equipment, which was acting as a massive, ungrounded antenna. Ian opened his mouth and said, "Ladies and gentle." The megaphone did not amplify his voice. Instead, it inhaled the ambient electromagnetic anxiety of the room and regurgitated it as a screech of acoustic feedback so pure, so high-pitched, and so violently loud that it threatened to shatter the fillings in every set of teeth within a 5-mile radius. It was a hellish, electronic shriek. It was the sound of a cyborg being slowly pushed through a cheese grater. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. At table 9, Cedric's bushy eyebrows shot up so high they nearly detached from his forehead. "Barnacle!" Bill clutched his chest, convinced his hearing aid had just become sentient, and declared war on his brain. But it was the pram-pushing brunch brigade that suffered the most devastating casualty. For the last hour, the 5 toddlers housed within the tactical strollers had been entirely placated by the quiet hum of the pub and half-chewed pieces of toast. They were calm. They were docile. The megaphone's screech shattered their peace. In perfect, horrifying unison, 5 toddlers inhaled deeply, and then they began to scream. It wasn't just crying. Oh no, it was a sustained, piercing wail of absolute, unvarnished outrage. It was a symphony of miniature fury. The mothers leaped into action, frantically digging through the compartments of their strollers, deploying dummies, deploying rice cakes, deploying brightly coloured plastic keys, but it was no use. The toddlers had tasted the electronic shriek, and they were demanding vengeance. "Calm down!" Ian yelled, forgetting to let go of the megaphone trigger, causing his voice to echo through the screeching feedback like a Dalek suffering from a head cold. "Please, remain in your seats. Do not panic. The authorities are, well, the authorities are probably also underwater, but do not panic." The pub was in absolute bedlam. Old men were shouting about the war. Young mothers were desperately rocking strollers back and forth like sailors trying to stabilize a sinking ship. Roxy was under a table, hugging her cables to protect them from the noise. Arthur the architect had placed half a grapefruit over each of his ears for acoustic shielding and was continuing his sausage-based mathematics. Through it all, in the very centre of the maelstrom, sat Table 14. Mrs. Higgins calmly finished the crossword clue for 4 down. The answer, aptly enough, was pandemonium, and reached for her cup of traditional English breakfast tea. She took a delicate sip, entirely ignoring the apocalyptic scenes unfolding around her. Sitting on the bench opposite her was Luna. Luna, the massive, Luna, the magnificent Akita. Luna, the medical alert dog. Luna, the lady of the manor. While the human beings around her lost every shred of their dignity, while the toddlers screamed and the manager hollered into a malfunctioning piece of plastic, Luna remained a monument of fluffy, unshakable stoicism. She sat perfectly upright in her neon high-visibility vest. She looked at Ian, who was currently wrestling with the megaphone as if it were a live badger. She looked at the screaming toddlers. She looked at the sparking doors. And then, with the supreme, elegant indifference that only a female dog of impeccable lineage can muster, Luna closed her ancient, soulful eyes, opened her massive jaws, and let out a long, slow, dramatically bored yawn. She smacked her chops together once, rested her giant head on her front paws right there on the table, and decided that if the humans were going to behave like this, she would simply have a nap until the silliness was over. The siege of the Sir Lance A. Boyle had begun, and the dog was entirely unimpressed. Chapter 4. The Two-Flight Toilet Expedition. By 12:15, the situation inside the Sir Lance A. Boyle had graduated from a mild local inconvenience to a full-blown existential crisis. Now, listen to me and titter ye not, because this is where the human spirit was tested to its absolute limits. Ooh, yes, the agony of it. The local power grid, which had been whimpering in the background like a nervous poodle, finally gave up the ghost. With a pathetic fizz-plop, the main lights extinguished entirely. The cavernous Art Deco interior of the repurposed cinema was instantly plunged into a dramatic subterranean twilight. The only illumination came from the green emergency exit signs, which cast an unearthly, radioactive glow over the dizzying maroon and gold swirls of the carpet, and the fruit machines, which were now blinking frantically in the dark like panicked neon robots, trying to signal a passing spaceship. It was a proper old-fashioned gloom, the sort of darkness that makes you want to check if you've still got your wallet and your trousers on, preferably in that order. But it wasn't the darkness that threatened to shatter the fragile peace of the siege. Oh nay, thrice nay. It was a far more urgent, deeply biological catastrophe. You see, a Wetherspoons is famous for many things. Cheap steaks, carpet patterns designed by a committee of corporate sadists, and, above all, the toilets. The toilets at the Sir Lance A. Boyle were not located nearby. Heavily influenced by the layout of every Wetherspoons across the realm, the journey to the facilities was an infamous, winding cross-country trek that involved navigating a labyrinth of fire doors, narrow corridors, and two massive, steep flights of stairs that ascended into the very rafters of the old 1930s cinema. In broad daylight, it was considered a moderately challenging hiking holiday. In the pitch black, it was practically an expedition to the summit of Mount Everest, only with less snow and considerably more anxiety. At table 9, Cedric was shifting uncomfortably on his padded bench. His bushy eyebrows were twitching in a state of high alarm. He had consumed 3 cups of filter coffee and 2 half-pints of bitter since 8 o'clock, and the laws of fluid dynamics were catching up with him with terrifying momentum. "Bill!" Cedric whispered hoarsely to Barnacle Bill, his voice trembling over the sound of the rain hammering the roof. "Bill, I'm in dire straits. The flood inside me is rivaling the flood outside. I need to make the ascent." Bill, whose hearing aid was still picking up a faint radio signal from a maritime weather broadcast, nodded sagely. "Aye, the shipping forecast says gale force winds in Dogger and Fisher, Cedric. Hold on to your hat." "I can't hold on much longer, Bill," Cedric whimpered, crossing his legs so tightly his knees made a cracking sound. It wasn't just Cedric. Across the room, a collective, desperate murmur was rising from the gloom. A trio of junior accountants trapped at table 5, who had been working on a tax audit over a pitcher of blue cocktails, were looking towards the dark stairwell with wide, haunted eyes. The human bladder, it turned out, was entirely unconcerned with regional power failures. Enter Gale. Gale the cleaner was standing at the base of the grand stairwell. In the green glow of the emergency light, she looked like a terrifying, vengeful deity. She had observed the shifting, agonized postures of the trapped regulars. She had seen the accountants eyeing the dark corners near the fruit machines. "No," Gale muttered, her voice cutting through the darkness like a rusty hacksaw. "Ooh, no, absolutely not. Not on my watch. Thrice nay." Gale possessed a deep-seated, pathological love for her freshly vacuumed, aggressively sticky carpet. The mere thought of 70 desperate, locked-in patrons treating the dark corners of her domain like a localized sewage treatment works filled her with a primal, industrial-grade fury. With a decisive nod, Gale sprang into action. She was a woman prepared for any eventuality. She marched to the cellar door and emerged pulling a thick, heavy, 70-foot nylon barrel line rope, the sort used to hoist heavy casks of ale through the pavement hatches. She tied one end of the massive rope securely around her own waist, knotting it with a flawless sailor's hitch. She then grabbed her heavy-duty blue plastic mop, holding it vertically before her like a tribal chief preparing to lead his warriors into a dense, foggy jungle. "Listen up!" Gale bellowed across the room, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "If you need the facilities, you line up now. You tie yourselves to the line. We move as one. We breathe as one. And if anyone steps off the path onto my clean tiles, I will personally throttle them with a secondary damp rag. Move!" The response was instantaneous. It was a stampede of the desperate. Cedric practically scrambled over the back of his booth, abandoning his flat cap in his haste. The 3 junior accountants from Table 5 scrambled out, clutching their fountain pens for security. 2 pensioners from the Breakfast Philosophers Brigade joined the queue, their joints clicking in a rhythmic, desperate percussive accompaniment to the storm. Within 2 minutes, Gale had a line of 7 terrified, cross-legged individuals tied at 6-foot intervals along the heavy nylon rope. It was a roped-together mountain expedition, a human caravan of pure, unadulterated desperation. Ian, the morning duty manager, watched this from behind the bar, holding a single sputtering birthday candle he'd found in a drawer. "Gale!" Ian cried out, his voice cracking with theatrical panic. "Be careful! The steps are treacherous! Ooh, the responsibility! If we lose an accountant on the first landing, the paperwork will take me until Michaelmas." Gale ignored him entirely. She turned to her rope of hostages. "Keep your eyes on the person in front of you. Do not look down into the abyss. If you feel dizzy, squeeze your pelvic floor. Follow me!" With a heroic grunt, Gale thrust her mop forward, planting the rubber tip onto the first dark step of the stairwell with the dramatic finality of a Sherpa driving an ice axe into a glacial crevasse. "Excellus!" she shouted, and the caravan began to move. Up they went into the dark. Step, click, groan, step. The surroundings were incredibly ominous. The walls of the old cinema stairwell were painted a deep, corporate burgundy that seemed to absorb what little light remained. As they ascended the first flight, the sounds of the main pub floor began to fade, replaced by the eerie, hollow whistling of the wind through the roof vents. It was pitch black, save for the tiny, flickering birthday candle Ian was holding far below, which made their shadows on the wall look like an army of giant, deformed spiders doing a frantic tango. "Gale!" Cedric gasped from third in line, his knees knocking violently together. "The altitude! The pressure! My left calf is seizing up, Gale! I think I've got the bends!" "Shut up, Cedric!" Gale barked from the front, aggressively testing the structural integrity of the next step with her mop handle. "We are only 8 steps up! Keep climbing or I'll use the chemical spray on you!" "I'm losing my footing!" one of the junior accountants whimpered from behind him. My loafers have no tread. I'm slipping into the corporate tax bracket. Hold the line, Gale commanded, her voice booming through the dark rafters. Do not let the rope slacken. Think of the clean porcelain at the summit. Think of the double-ply toilet paper. Focus. Meanwhile, down below at table 14, the world remained entirely civilized. Mrs. Higgins had successfully navigated the darkness by producing a miniature, wind-up torch from her handbag, which she was using to read her newspaper. Sitting opposite her, completely unbothered by the darkness, the power failure, or the roped caravan of groaning humans ascending the stairs, was Luna the Akita. Luna, the lady of the house, was currently sitting perfectly upright, her fluffy chest puffed out, her neon high-visibility vest catching the faint green glow of the emergency sign. She was observing the stairwell with a look of profound feminine amusement. Her ears were pricked forward, tracking the heavy, rhythmic thudding of Gale's mop and the desperate whimpers of the accountants as they disappeared into the ceiling. Luna let out a soft, delicate snort, the canine equivalent of a giggle, and turned her head to look at Ian, who was still standing behind the bar, shivering and holding his tiny birthday candle like a very worried, short-sleeved monk. Luna gave her massive, fluffy tail a single, slow, rhythmic wag against the wooden booth, thud, thud, as if to say, "Look at the ridiculous things your species does when the lights go out." Up on the second landing, the expedition had hit a major obstacle. The roof leak from Chapter 2 had managed to find its way down the internal wall, creating a highly localized, incredibly treacherous sheet of wet slime directly across the final 3 steps leading to the gentlemen's facilities. Gale halted the line. She held her mop aloft, squinting through the gloom. "Hold!" she ordered. The line of 7 people instantly slammed into each other like a row of falling dominoes, resulting in a chorus of theatrical oohs and ahs that would have done Frankie Howard proud. "What is it, Gale?" Cedric panicked, clutching the rope as if it were his only link to mortality. "Is it a crevasse? Is it an avalanche? Tell me it's not a closed sign." "Worse," Gale whispered darkly. "It's high humidity moisture build-up on the varnish. It's like ice, Cedric. One wrong step and you'll slide all the way back down to the fruit machines, destroying 3 fire extinguishers on the way." The accountants began to weep softly. "We can't go back," one whispered. "The tax codes, the fluid retention, it's too much." Gale tightened her grip on her mop. She looked at the summit. The bright white door of the toilets was visible just 10 feet away in the green glow of the upper emergency light. It was the promised land. "Stand back," Gale commanded. She took a deep breath, braced her sensible, non-slip orthopedic shoes against the dry timber of the landing, and began to swing her mop with terrifying velocity. She wasn't just cleaning, she was aggressively friction-drying the steps. She applied her mop to the wet varnish with the speed and ferocity of a professional curling team trying to guide a stone into the Olympic rings. Swish, 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 swish. The sheer heat generated by Gale's intense, furious mopping action caused the moisture to instantly evaporate into a small, localized cloud of steam. "The path is clear," Gale shouted, gasping for air but triumphant. "Move! Move! Move!" With a unified cry of relief, the caravan surged forward. Gale untied the rope at the summit, and the 7 hostages scrambled through the doors into the facilities with the frantic energy of gold prospectors arriving in the Yukon. 10 minutes later, the caravan descended back down the stairs, their faces completely transformed. The look of existential terror had been replaced by a serene, glowing tranquility. They walked with a light, bouncy step, their bladders emptied, their souls restored. Gale led them back onto the main pub floor, coiling her 70-foot rope over her shoulder like a heroic cowboy returning from a successful cattle drive. She untied herself, leaned her mop against the bar, and fixed Ian with a look of supreme triumph. "The summit was conquered," Gale announced deadpan. "No casualties. Carpet remains pristine." Ian let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief, blowing out his tiny birthday candle as he did so. "Gale, my dear, you are a treasure, a monument to the hospitality sector. Ooh, I could kiss you, but company policy strictly prohibits physical contact with the maintenance staff." At table 14, Luna the Akita watched the triumphant explorers return to their booths. As Cedric sat down, letting out a massive sigh of contentment, Luna looked across at him, gave a tiny, dignified nod of her massive, fluffy head, and then let out another long, content, feminine yawn. The great toilet expedition of 12:45 p.m. was over. The pub was still trapped, but the front line had held. Chapter 5. Structural Integrity of a Sausage. It was precisely 1:30 in the afternoon, though you would be entirely forgiven for assuming it was midnight in the belly of a particularly depressed whale. Inside the Sir Lance A. Boyle, the atmosphere had shifted from acute panic to a sort of resigned, damp theatricality. The local power grid was still thoroughly deceased, leaving the cavernous Art Deco pub bathed in the sickly, radioactive green glow of the emergency exit signs. Outside, the great Gloucester deluge continued without a shred of mercy, transforming the high street into a raging, muddy canal. Now, listen to me. Gather round and pay attention, because the human spirit in captivity is a wondrous and terrible thing to behold. At table 14, the beacon of civilization continued to burn brightly. Mrs. Higgins, having finished her crossword in the gloom, had produced a small, battery-operated travel radio from her handbag. She had it pressed to her ear, listening to an agricultural report on the price of winter cabbage, with an expression of supreme, unbothered calm. Sitting directly opposite her on the padded booth was Luna. Luna, the massive, impossibly fluffy Akita, the absolute lady of the manor, the undisputed queen of the sticky carpet. She sat perfectly upright, her high-visibility medical alert vest glowing faintly green in the shadows. Luna was a female of impeccable breeding, and she was observing the trapped humans with the gentle, pitying gaze of an aristocrat watching the peasantry fail to understand a simple parlor trick. She gave her tail a single, slow, elegant sweep across the varnished wood. She was entirely at peace. The rest of the pub, however, was not at peace. Behind the main bar, Ian, the morning duty manager, was pacing. He was a man composed entirely of frayed nerves, sensible tailoring, and rising stomach acid. He marched up and down the damp, rubberized mats behind the beer pumps, wringing his hands together like a tragic heroine in a Victorian melodrama. "Ooh, the waiting," Ian whispered to the empty glass wash machine. "The endless, suffocating waiting. We are marooned. Marooned on an island of spilled cider and misplaced ambitions. Mock me if you must, but I tell you, my sciatica is playing a symphony of doom." And then he heard it. I promised I would not subject you to vulgar sound effects, so I shall describe the noise with the gravity it deserves. It was a rhythmic, watery tapping, a persistent, hollow, percussive striking, like a ghostly accountant using a wet abacus directly above Ian's head. Ian froze. His short-sleeved shirt clung to his damp back. He slowly, agonizingly craned his neck upwards. The vaulted, historically protected plaster ceiling of the 1930s cinema was failing. A dark, ominous patch of moisture, roughly the size and shape of the Isle of Wight, was blooming aggressively across the plasterwork. And right in the centre of the Isle of Wight, a steady, relentless stream of Gloucester rainwater was plummeting downwards. But it was not the water itself that caused Ian's heart to stop completely. It was where the water was landing. Behind the bar, mounted proudly on the wall, was the main electrical breaker box. It was a large, grey metal cabinet containing the vital, throbbing arteries of the pub's infrastructure. And the roof leak was positioned directly, perfectly, with absolute, malicious geometric precision over the top of this box. The water was currently pooling on the top lip of the metal casing, threatening to spill over and cascade directly into the exposed circuits. Ian gasped. It was a high, strangled intake of breath that echoed across the quiet bar. "No," Ian mouthed, his eyes widening to the size of side plates. "No, please, merciful heavens, not the breaker box, not the cellar circuits. Oh, the humanity, not the chillers." You see, those specific breakers powered the cellar's industrial beer line chillers. Those chillers were the only thing standing between the pub and the absolute, unmitigated disaster of warm ale. "If those breakers short out," Ian soliloquized, gripping his own hair in a frenzy of theatrical agony, "the temperature in the cellar will rise. The Doom Bar will begin to ferment. The Abbot Ale will reach room temperature. Do you know what happens, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, when you present a British pensioner with a pint of lukewarm, uncarbonated bitter? It is a violation of the Magna Carta. It is a war crime. There will be a mutiny. They will tear up the sticky carpets with their bare hands." Ian lunged for a stack of clean bar towels. He frantically threw them on top of the breaker box, but the water was coming down too fast. The towels soaked through in seconds, becoming useless, heavy, damp sponges. "It's no good," Ian cried, addressing the blinking fruit machines. "The towels are inadequate. The structural integrity of the cotton is failing. We need an engineer. We need a miracle. Ooh, I'm palpitating. I truly am." Ian's frantic gaze swept across the dark, cavernous pub. He looked at the breakfast philosophers, currently debating the merits of rationing. He looked at the brunch brigade, rocking their tactical strollers. He looked at DJ Roxy, who was attempting to use a battery-powered tuning fork to measure the humidity. Useless. All of them. Completely useless in the face of a plumbing emergency. And then his eyes fell upon Table 42. Sitting alone in the gloom was Arthur the architect. Arthur was currently staring mournfully at a plate containing the soggy, collapsed ruins of his hash-brown Stonehenge. He was using a miniature spirit level to gently push a piece of saturated black pudding around the plate, a picture of absolute, tragic defeat. A manic gleam entered Ian's eye, a spark of pure, desperate, managerial inspiration. Ian scrambled over the wooden bar counter, ignoring every single health and safety protocol he had ever memorized, and sprinted across the maroon and gold carpet. "Arthur!" Ian whispered fiercely, slamming his hands down on table 42, causing Arthur to drop his spirit level. "Arthur, my dear, brilliant, eccentric man, I need you. The pub needs you. The realm needs you. Arthur adjusted his tweed jacket, looking at Ian with supreme fussy suspicion. I am in mourning, Ian. The western archway has collapsed. The baked bean mortar was insufficient against the ambient moisture. Leave me to my grief. Forget the henge, Ian pleaded, pointing wildly toward the bar. We have a catastrophic breach. The roof is leaking directly onto the cellar breaker box. If it shorts out, the beer chillers die. The ale will boil, Arthur. It will boil. Arthur's eyes narrowed. The fussy, retired local vanished, replaced by the steely, calculating gaze of a master builder presented with an impossible commission. He stood up, slowly, deliberately wiping a trace of bean juice from his lapel. Show me the site, Arthur commanded, his voice dropping a full octave into a register of pure gravel. Ian led Arthur behind the bar. Arthur stood before the leaking ceiling and the metal breaker box. He did not panic. He did not shout. He simply produced his metal tape measure, extended it to the ceiling, checked the angle of the wall, and calculated the flow rate of the incoming water by tapping his chin thoughtfully. The water is pooling on the upper lip of the casing, Arthur diagnosed, his tone entirely clinical. It will breach the seal in approximately 4 minutes. Cotton towels are porous. They lack density. We need a retaining wall, a waterproof dam to divert the flow away from the electrical components and down the side of the wall into the drip trays. Yes! Yes! Ian cheered, practically vibrating out of his shoes. Whatever you need, Arthur, you have carte blanche. I give you the keys to the kingdom. Arthur turned to Ian, his expression deadpan. I need the walk-in freezer. I need raw, unyielding building materials. Bring me the thick-cut catering chips, Ian. The frozen ones. They possess a rigorous, starchy density that cannot be matched by brick or mortar. And I need binding agent. I need mayonnaise. Ian blinked. Mayonnaise. Not the low-fat nonsense, Arthur barked, his eyes flashing with the passion of a true artisan. I need the industrial vat, the catering-grade emulsion, the thick, gelatinous stuff that looks like it could patch a pothole on the M5 motorway, and bring me 5 links of uncooked black pudding for the foundation pylons. Move, man, before we lose the ale. Ian did not question him. Ian sprinted into the back kitchen, throwing open the heavy silver door of the walk-in freezer. He emerged seconds later, his arms laden with a massive 10-pound bag of frozen, crinkle-cut chips, a plastic tub of mayonnaise the size of a small drum kit, and a string of dense, terrifyingly heavy black puddings. Arthur the architect cracked his knuckles. It was his finest hour. Observe and learn, Ian, Arthur said, taking the tub of mayonnaise and prying the lid off. The smell of vinegar and intense synthetic egg product filled the air behind the bar. Arthur moved with the speed and precision of a concert pianist. He took a heavy plastic spatula and slapped a thick, generous layer of industrial mayonnaise directly onto the top of the metal breaker box. He applied it with a heavy, wet finality, spreading it evenly to create a sticky, waterproof base layer. The emulsion, Arthur lectured, entirely ignoring the water raining down on his tweed shoulders, repels the moisture. It is a hydrophobic barrier of pure cholesterol. Next came the foundation. Arthur took the dense, uncooked black puddings and laid them end to end along the back edge of the box, pressing them firmly into the mayonnaise. They formed a solid, unyielding barricade against the wall. Now the masonry, Arthur declared. He ripped open the bag of frozen catering chips. The temperature of the frozen potato instantly began to freeze the mayonnaise, creating a terrifyingly strong, icy mortar. Arthur began to stack the chips, interlocking them like a bricklayer building a garden wall. He worked frantically, his hands flying, building a miniature, frozen, retaining wall along the front edge of the breaker box. Ian watched in absolute, mesmerized awe. He was witnessing a miracle, a greasy, highly irregular, health code-violating miracle. "Titter ye not, Ian," Arthur scolded, noticing Ian's open mouth. "This is basic physics. The freezing temperature of the potato locks the emulsion. The starches expand. We are creating an impermeable fortress." The wall grew higher. 2 inches, 3 inches. Arthur layered mayonnaise, then chips, then mayonnaise, finishing it off with a final, elegant capping layer of perfectly aligned crinkle cuts. The water from the ceiling hit the top of the box, but it did not breach the edge. It hit the frozen potato wall, swelled up against the mayonnaise barrier, and had nowhere to go. "It's holding," Ian whispered, clutching his chest. "Of course it's holding," Arthur replied, wiping his mayonnaise-coated hands on a napkin. "But we must divert the flow, lest the pressure compromise the foundation." Arthur carefully took his spatula and carved a small, precise trench through the mayonnaise on the far left side of the dam. The pooled water instantly found the escape route. It flowed cleanly through the trench, entirely bypassing the electrical circuits, and cascaded safely down the wall directly into a large plastic drip tray Ian had positioned on the floor. The breaker box remained completely dry. The beer chillers continued to hum safely in the cellar. The ale was secure. Ian fell to his knees. He actually fell to his knees on the damp, rubberized matting. He looked up at the magnificent, bizarre, stinking fortress of frozen chips and black pudding that sat atop the electrical box. "Arthur," Ian breathed, a single tear of pure, unadulterated relief sliding down his cheek. "You are not just an architect. You are a savior. You are the Michelangelo of the frozen food aisle. I will comp your breakfast for the rest of your natural life." Arthur adjusted his collar, maintaining his absolute fussy dignity. "Just ensure the beans are kept in a separate ramekin from now on, Ian. I cannot work under these soggy conditions." From across the dark, silent pub, a solitary noise broke the quiet. It was Luna the Akita. The magnificent lady dog sitting at table 14 had watched the entire frantic construction process with her ancient, soulful eyes. She looked at the frantic manager on his knees. She looked at the tweed-clad architect wiping mayonnaise from his lapel. She looked at the frozen potato dam saving the pub's electricity. Luna slowly, deliberately, lifted her massive, fluffy right paw and tapped it twice against the wooden table. Thud, thud. It was an applause, a quiet, aristocratic acknowledgement of a job well done. She then laid her head back down on her paws, closed her eyes, and returned to her nap. The pub had survived another hour. The electrical grid was safe. The ale was safe. And Arthur the architect returned to his table, a quiet hero in a tweed jacket, having successfully defended the Sir Lance A. Boyle with nothing but a bag of chips and the absolute, unshakable structural integrity of a British sausage. Chapter 6. The Akita's Hour. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the psychological landscape within the Sir Lance A. Boyle had deteriorated from a state of mild, grumbling inconvenience to a scene resembling the fall of the Roman Empire, only with significantly more tweed and a distinct lack of indoor plumbing. Now, I ask you, listen to me, gather round and pay attention, because the human psyche is a fragile, delicate thing. Ooh, it is. Titter ye not, for I speak the absolute truth. You take 70 decent, law-abiding British citizens, you lock them inside a repurposed 1930s cinema, you plunge them into a sickly, radioactive green gloom, and you deprive them of their fundamental human right to a hot cup of tea. What do you get? I shall tell you what you get. You get absolute, unvarnished, Lord of the Flies savagery, only instead of a conch shell, they are worshipping a discarded beer mat. The silence that had so oppressively governed the pub in the morning was entirely dead and buried. In its place was a maddening, relentless cacophony of despair. The roof continued to leak, providing a torturous, rhythmic dripping sound that echoed off the Art Deco plasterwork like a water torture device designed by a committee of sadistic plumbers. Behind the main bar, Ian, the morning duty manager, had entirely given up the ghost. The man was a hollow shell. His sensible short-sleeved shirt was wrinkled. His tie was draped over his left ear for reasons known only to himself, and he was currently sitting on an upturned beer crate, quietly counting packets of dry roasted peanuts just to maintain a fragile grip on reality. 42, 43, 44, Ian whispered, rocking back and forth. If we ration the peanuts, we can survive until Tuesday. But who will govern the peanut distribution? I am too weak to lead. They will turn on me. They will use my name badge as currency. Oh, the sheer, unadulterated agony of hospitality. Out on the main floor, cabin fever was reaching a rolling, frothing boil. The pram-pushing brunch brigade, previously a united front of exhausted motherhood, had begun to fracture under the strain. The tactical all-terrain strollers had been pushed together to form a defensive barricade. Inside this fortress, the 5 toddlers had synchronized their whining. It was no longer merely crying. It was a sustained, atonal hum of pure grievance. They had run out of organic rice cakes at precisely 2:15, and now, armed with nothing but soggy rusks and an innate sense of injustice, they were demanding tribute. On the opposite side of the room, near the flashing, frantic lights of the dormant fruit machines, the breakfast philosophers were reverting to a state of primal nature. Cedric, whose bushy eyebrows had seemingly declared independence and were currently trying to migrate to the back of his neck, had fashioned a makeshift spear by taping a plastic stirring spoon to the end of his walking stick. "We must claim the high ground, Bill," Cedric hissed, adjusting his flat cap to a rakish, aggressive angle. "The mothers are weak. They are distracted by the wailing of their progeny. If we strike now, we can commandeer the soft seating in the booths." Barnacle. Bill, adjusting his hearing aid, nodded with terrifying grimness. "Aye, Cedric. The wind is changing. I can smell mutiny in the air. We show them no quarter." And then the catalyst appeared, the spark that would ignite the powder keg. Sitting on the stainless steel pass that separated the kitchen from the bar, illuminated only by the faint green glow of an emergency exit sign, was a single plate, and upon this plate rested the final solitary remnant of the morning food service. It was a hash brown. It was not a particularly magnificent hash brown. It was cold. It was slightly misshapen. It possessed the dense, greasy structural integrity that Arthur the architect so prized. But in the starved, desperate, cabin-fevered minds of the trapped patrons. It was the Holy Grail. It was a golden triangle of pure, life-sustaining potato. It was hope, deep-fried and served on porcelain. A mother from the brunch brigade, a woman whose eyes were wide with the manic energy of someone who had not slept since 2023, spotted it first. She pointed a trembling finger towards the pass. "Carbohydrates," she gasped. "For the children. We must have it." Cedric saw her pointing. He turned his gaze. His bushy eyebrows twitched in unison. "Potato," he breathed, gripping his walking stick spear. "Sustenance for the elders. It is ours by right of seniority." The pub seemed to hold its collective breath. The rhythmic dripping from the ceiling suddenly sounded like a ticking time bomb. With a unified, terrifying slowness, the two factions began to move. The mothers advanced from the left, abandoning their tactical strollers, their faces set in masks of maternal desperation. The pensioners advanced from the right, their orthopedic shoes squeaking aggressively on the sticky maroon and gold carpet, moving with the jerky, synchronized menace of a geriatric street gang. They converged in the center aisle, directly between the bar and the fruit machines. "Hold fast," Cedric commanded, raising a trembling hand. He glared across the 4 feet of carpet separating him from the lead mother. "Madam, I implore you to yield. I survived the winter of '63. I have eaten things out of a tin that would make a billy goat weep. That hash brown belongs to the old guard." The lead mother stepped forward, her posture terrifyingly rigid. "My son, Tarquin, has just entered the terrible twos," she replied, her voice dropping into a register of pure Arctic ice. "He has not had a nap. He has thrown a plastic hippo at my head 3 times in the last hour. If he does not receive a triangle of fried potato within the next 2 minutes, he will unleash a tantrum that will shatter the remaining window glass. Step aside, pensioner, or I shall not be held responsible for the consequences." The tension snapped. It was absolute pandemonium. A riot broke out on the sticky carpet. It was a terribly British riot, consisting mostly of aggressive tutting, sharp elbows, and highly polite but vicious insults regarding each other's choice of knitwear. But it was a riot nonetheless. "Unhand my cardigan," Bill shouted, swinging a rolled-up newspaper. "Give us the potato!" a mother shrieked, wielding a brightly coloured plastic teething ring like a set of brass knuckles. Behind the bar, Ian peered over the edge of the mahogany. "Gale," he whimpered. "Gale, do something. The social contract has evaporated. It's a massacre of sensible clothing." Gale, the cleaner, stepped out from the shadows. She held her blue plastic mop aloft, her face a mask of furious, righteous authority. She was Boudica facing the Roman legions. "Right!" Gale bellowed, her voice echoing into the rafters. "That is enough! The first person who bleeds on my carpet is getting sprayed with industrial window cleaner. Separate!" But they did not separate. The madness had taken them. The toddlers, sensing the chaos, amplified their wailing into a deafening, harmonic chorus of pure distress. Roxy, the DJ, huddled under a corner booth, began to weep, convinced the acoustic vibrations of the riot would permanently ruin her carefully untangled cables. It was the end of days. Civilization within the Sir Lance A. Boyle had completely collapsed. And then, amidst the screaming, the tutting, the dripping, and the squeaking of rubber soles, a new presence made itself known. At table 14, Mrs. Higgins had fallen asleep, her chin resting comfortably on her chest, completely oblivious to the war raging 30 feet away. But her companion was not asleep. Luna, the massive, magnificent Akita, had been watching the proceedings with growing, ladylike disapproval. She had tolerated the power cut. She had tolerated the roped expedition to the toilets. She had even tolerated the manager weeping over a pile of peanuts. But this undignified, noisy, chaotic squabbling over a cold piece of potato, it was simply unacceptable. It was poor form. Luna possessed a deep, ancestral dignity. She was a lady of the highest pedigree, a medical alert dog of supreme intellect, and she simply would not allow this sort of unseemly behavior in her presence any longer. With a slow, deliberate grace, Luna stood up. She did not scramble. She did not rush. She rose to her full, imposing height. In the sickly green glow of the emergency lights, her high-visibility neon vest shone like the armor of a holy crusader. Her massive, fluffy chest puffed out, her ears pricked forward to maximum attention, and her tail curled over her back like an elegant, furry scimitar. She stepped down from the booth. Click-clack, click-clack. Her massive paws hit the sticky carpet. She walked slowly, with the unhurried swagger of an apex predator, walking through a flock of particularly noisy, dim-witted sheep, directly into the center aisle. She stopped precisely halfway between the warring factions of the breakfast philosophers and the brunch brigade. She stood absolutely still. She surveyed the rioting humans, turning her massive, bear-like head slowly from left to right. Her dark, soulful eyes locked onto Cedric, who froze mid-tut. She turned her gaze to the lead mother, who slowly lowered her plastic teething ring. The sheer, physical presence of the dog was magnetic. The toddlers, peeking out from their tactical strollers, saw the giant, fluffy wolf creature standing in the aisle and were instantly shocked into total, unblinking silence. Luna inhaled. It was a deep, expansive intake of breath. You could visibly see her massive, barrel-like chest expand. The air in the pub seemed to rush toward her, sucked in by the sheer gravitational pull of her lungs. And then, Luna the Akita issued her reprimand. I promised I would not use vulgar sound effects, so I ask you to imagine a sound that does not merely enter the ears, but travels directly through the floorboards, travels up through your sensible shoes, bypasses your internal organs entirely, and vibrates directly against your sternum. It was a vocalization of such profound, booming magnitude, such deep architectural resonance, that it seemed to rattle the very foundations of the repurposed 1930s cinema. It was a single, authoritative, earth-shattering syllable. It was the sound of Mother Nature herself slamming a heavy oak door on a misbehaving universe. It was the canine equivalent of a headmistress slamming a wooden ruler onto a desk and demanding absolute, immediate obedience. The concussive wave of the bark swept across the pub. The effect was instantaneous. It was nothing short of miraculous. It was a complete psychological reset of 70 human brains. The riot died instantly. The aggressive tutting ceased. Cedric dropped his makeshift spear, his mouth hanging open. The mothers froze, their hands hovering in the air. The sheer volume and absolute, unshakable maternal authority of the female dog had tapped into a primal, deep-seated recess of the human mind. The madness evaporated, replaced instantly by a wave of intense, overwhelming British embarrassment. They looked at the dog looked at them. Luna's expression was one of severe, matronly disappointment. She did not bare her teeth. She did not growl. She simply stared, radiating the unmistakable message. Really? Is this how we behave in public? Over a potato? Right, Cedric muttered, his face turning the colour of a boiled beetroot in the green light. He cleared his throat, suddenly intensely aware of how ridiculous he looked, holding a plastic spoon taped to a walking stick. Well, yes. Let's not lose our heads, shall we? Quite right, the lead mother whispered, her cheeks burning. She quickly tucked the teething ring into her cardigan pocket and smoothed down her hair. There are children present. We must maintain standards. The transformation was absolute. The deep-seated, genetically coded DNA of British queuing etiquette, temporarily suspended by the cabin fever, came rushing back with a vengeance. Without a single word spoken between them, the two factions stepped back. Cedric gestured politely toward the pass. Madam, please, I insist. For the little ones. The youth are the future, after all. Oh, no, I couldn't possibly, the mother replied, stepping back and offering a gracious, incredibly polite smile. You are our elders. We must respect our seniors. Please take the hash brown. I'm sure Tarquin can manage a rusk. No, I insist, Cedric bowed. I simply wouldn't hear of it, the mother counterbowed. A perfectly straight, terribly polite queue instantly formed in front of the pass. Order was miraculously, beautifully restored. The toddlers, still staring wide-eyed at the giant fluffy dog, remained perfectly, angelically silent. Behind the bar, Ian slowly raised his head above the mahogany counter. He looked at the polite queue. He looked at the silent toddlers. And then he looked at Luna. Ian's eyes filled with hot, genuine tears of gratitude. He clasped his hands together in a posture of fervent prayer. Oh, you beautiful, majestic beast, Ian whispered, his voice trembling with religious awe. You absolute queen among mortals. You have saved my pub. You have saved my sanity. I will personally buy you a whole chicken. I will roast it myself. I will serve it to you on a silver platter, so help me. Gail the cleaner slowly lowered her mop, leaning on the handle. She looked at Luna, and for the first time in perhaps a decade, the corner of Gail's mouth twitched upwards into a genuine, respectful half-smile. Good girl, Gail grunted softly. Good girl. Having successfully quelled the uprising, Luna did not linger to accept the adoration of her subjects. She had performed her duty. She had restored civility. With a soft, elegant snort of satisfaction, Luna turned around. Her massive paws clicked rhythmically against the floor tiles as she padded slowly, with supreme, unbothered dignity, back to table 14. She hopped back onto the padded bench opposite the sleeping Mrs. Higgins. She sat perfectly upright for a moment, adjusting her high-visibility vest, before curling her massive, fluffy body into a comfortable, luxurious circle. She rested her chin on her front paws, closed her eyes, and went back to sleep. The pub remained utterly, beautifully quiet, save for the gentle dripping of the rain and the whispered, polite negotiations over who truly deserved the cold hash brown. The madness had broken. The Akita had spoken, and the Salance A. Boyle had survived its darkest hour. Chapter 7. The 5:30 p.m. playlist. Now, I ask you to cast your mind's eye to the large, slightly greasy digital clock situated upon the main till of the Sir Lance A. Boyle. It was 5:28 p.m. The interior of the repurposed Art Deco cinema was in a state of terminal, apocalyptic exhaustion. If you were to take the general concept of human misery, wrap it in a damp cardigan, and force it to sit on a sticky carpet for 8 hours, you would only begin to approach the sheer, unadulterated state of decay within the room. Ooh, the agony of it! Please, titter ye not, for these were brave souls. The air inside the sealed pub was thick. It smelled powerfully of wet wool, industrial mayonnaise, lukewarm tea, and the desperate, lingering anxiety of 70 people who had stared into the abyss of a broken toilet queue and lived to tell the tale. Behind the mahogany barricade of the main bar, Ian, the morning duty manager, had transcended mere physical fatigue. He was no longer a man. He was a monument to the hospitality sector constructed entirely of frayed nerves and stomach acid. He was leaning heavily against the ale pumps, his tie hanging completely backward down his spine, his sensibly tailored trousers wrinkled beyond the help of any known iron. He was currently trying to calculate how much severance pay he would receive if he simply walked out the back fire escape and started a new life as a hermit in the Cotswolds. And then a miracle occurred. It did not happen with a grand fanfare. It happened with a whimper, the relentless, drumming, aggressive hammering of the Gloucester rain upon the roof simply stopped. It didn't taper off. It just gave up, as if the sky had checked its watch, realized it was the end of the working day, and decided to clock off. The torturous, rhythmic dripping from the ceiling slowed to a halt. Arthur the architect's frozen chip and black pudding dam, which had valiantly saved the cellar breakers, gave one final icy shudder, its duty fulfilled. In the sudden, hollow quiet of the pub, a new noise drifted through the single-pane glass of the front windows. It was the faint, beautiful, soaring sound of a two-tone emergency siren in the distance. To Ian, it sounded like a choir of angels playing the trumpets of salvation. "Listen!" Cedric gasped from the centre aisle, raising his makeshift spoon spear towards the ceiling. "Do you hear it, Bill? The cavalry! The siege is broken! We're going to live to complain about the council tax another day!" Outside, the muddy floodwaters that had turned the High Street into a tributary of the River Severn had begun to rapidly recede, vanishing down the overwhelmed drains with a loud, gurgling slurp. And then a shadow fell across the fused, completely, utterly ruined automatic glass doors. It was a man wearing a council-issued high-visibility jacket that was so neon it practically burned the retinas. He wore a yellow hard hat and an expression of profound, glorious, bureaucratic boredom. In his right hand, he carried a 3-foot steel crowbar. Ian pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging up the pane. "Oh, you beautiful, beautiful civil servant," Ian wept openly. "Pry us free! Release us from this purgatory of damp pensioners!" The council worker wedged the flat end of the crowbar into the gap between the fused doors. He gave a single, mighty, entirely non-dramatic heave. The doors did not glide open. They surrendered with a noise akin to a medieval drawbridge being ripped from its hinges by a particularly aggressive dragon. The glass panels juddered, sparked once for old time's sake, and were brutally forced apart, leaving a gap wide enough for a sensible hatchback to drive through. The rush of fresh, cool, rain-washed Gloucestershire air that flooded into the stale, damp pub was nothing short of intoxicating. It smelled of wet tarmac, freedom, and the distinct lack of stale beer. The trapped morning crowd did not cheer. They were British, after all. Cheering would have been deeply inappropriate. But there was a collective, heavy exhalation of breath. "Right then," Cedric announced, straightening his flat cap and casually discarding his spear. into a nearby umbrella stand. I suppose that's that. Come along, Bill. Countdown is on in 20 minutes, and I haven't fed the cat. The great exodus began. The breakfast philosophers shuffled out into the wet evening air, nodding politely to the council worker as they passed. The pram-pushing brunch brigade manoeuvre their tactical, all-terrain strollers through the gap with military precision, the toddlers inside finally asleep, their tiny faces smeared with the exhaustion of a hard day's rioting. Arthur the architect walked past the bar. He paused, looked at his masterpiece of frozen potatoes and mayonnaise sitting atop the electrical box, and gave a solemn, respectful bow. He reached into his tweed pocket and placed a shiny £2 coin on the bar counter. "For the mayonnaise, Ian," Arthur said gravely, "and a word of advice. When you dismantle it, chip away the black pudding first. It's load-bearing." "Thank you, Arthur," Ian whispered, too weak to refuse the tip. "You are a gentleman and a scholar." And then the final departure. From table 14, Mrs. Higgins stood up, adjusted her floral headscarf, and picked up her handbag. She walked toward the exit with the slow, terrifying dignity of a monarch, leaving a somewhat disappointing state dinner. Beside her walked Luna. The massive, impossibly fluffy female Akita had awoken from her nap. She paused in the center of the dizzying maroon and gold carpet. She executed an elegant, luxurious, deeply feminine stretch, extending her front paws and bowing her majestic head. She shook her coat, her high-visibility vest rustling softly, and then looked directly at Ian behind the bar. Ian stood up straight. He ignored the pain in his sciatica. He ignored his ruined tie. He looked at the medical alert dog who had saved his pub from absolute anarchy with a single bark. Ian brought his right hand up to his forehead and executed a flawless, trembling military salute. Luna observed the salute. She did not bark. She simply gave her massive, fluffy tail one slow, regal sweep of acknowledgement, turned on her heel, and padded out the door into the evening light, her massive paws clicking softly on the damp pavement until she disappeared from view. The pub was empty. It was a disaster zone of crushed napkins, abandoned newspapers, spilled water, and greasy plates. But it was empty. Ian slumped backward, sliding slowly down the mahogany woodwork until he was sitting on the damp, rubberized floor mats. A single solitary tear of pure, unfiltered relief escaped his left eye and tracked a clean line down his cheek. "We did it, Gale," Ian whispered to the ceiling. "We held the line. The ale is safe. The carpet is, well, the carpet is a biohazard, but we survived. The war is over." Gale the cleaner stood in the center of the empty pub. She looked at the devastation. She looked at her blue plastic mop with a dramatic sigh that spoke volumes of her contempt for the human race. Gale opened her hand. The heavy mop fell to the floor with a dull, heavy thud. She was off the clock. Ian closed his eyes. The silence of the pub wrapped around him like a warm, comforting blanket. Peace, perfect, golden, silent peace. On the till, the digital clock ticked from 17:29:59 to 17:30. I must now explain a fundamental, terrifying truth about the corporate structure of Wetherspoons. The music policy is not controlled by the managers. It is not controlled by the staff. It is controlled by a central, automated mainframe located somewhere in a windowless industrial estate in Watford. And this mainframe knows only one law. Before 5:30 p.m., silence. At 5:30 p.m. on a Friday, absolute, unmitigated chaos. The transition was not gradual. There was no fade in. In a fraction of a millisecond, the absolute silence of the pub was violently, brutally assassinated by the opening, heavily synthesized bass notes of a 2010s club anthem, played at a volume designed to vibrate the internal organs of anyone within a 10-mile radius. The speakers, mounted in the corners of the high Art Deco ceilings, roared to life. The acoustic force was physical. It literally blew the paper napkins off the bar. The floorboards trembled. The fruit machines, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, seemed to flash with a renewed predatory intensity. Ian's eyes snapped open. The warm blanket of silence had been ripped away and replaced by a thumping, deafening, four-to-the-floor dance beat. "No!" Ian shrieked, though he couldn't even hear his own voice over the music. "No, the silence! Bring back the silence!" At table 8, a resurrection was occurring. Roxy, the DJ, who had spent the last 7 hours huddled in a corner, nursing her acoustic trauma and whispering to her cables, suddenly shot upright. The music had hit her like a bolt of pure electricity. Her eyes were wide, manic, and completely alive. She grabbed her perfectly, meticulously untangled knot of XLR cables. She threw her oversized headphones onto her head. She vaulted out of the booth with the agility of an Olympic gymnast and sprinted towards the DJ podium in the corner of the room. She was plugging cables into the mixing desk with a frantic, terrifying speed, her hands a blur of black fingernails and copper wire. The Lloyd's #1 bar transformation had begun. Ian pulled himself up by the beer taps, his head throbbing in time with the relentless bass drum. He looked out the open, ruined front doors. The council worker was gone. The quiet evening street was gone. Replacing them, swarming down the pavement like a highly tanned, overly perfumed invading army, was the Friday night crowd. There were hundreds of them, young men in shirts that were 2 sizes too small, shivering aggressively in the cool evening air. Young women in dresses the size of postage stamps, navigating the puddles on 6-inch heels with the balance of tightrope walkers. They saw the open doors of the Sir Lance A. Boyle. They heard the thumping bass of the music. They let out a collective, feral roar that completely drowned out the music. It was a battle cry of the thirsty, the young, and the heavily pre-drunked. They surged forward, a tidal wave of fake tan and cheap aftershave pouring through the ruined entrance and flooding onto the sticky carpet. Ian stumbled backward, clutching the bar for support. The morning war was over, yes. The pensioners had retreated, but a new, far more terrifying conflict had instantly begun. "Gale!" Ian yelled, looking frantically around for his general. "Gale! We need to man the barricades. We need VKs. We need the Sours. Gale!" But Gale was gone. Her mop lay abandoned on the floor, a silent testament to a cleaner who knew when to retreat. Ian frantically patted his pockets. He pulled out a crumpled, damp piece of paper. It was his weekly schedule. He squinted at it through the flashing, strobing lights that Roxy was now aggressively triggering from her booth. Duty manager, Ian. Shift, 800 to 1700. Ian breathed a sigh of relief. He was done. He could leave. He could escape out the back door and never look back. But then his eyes drifted to the next line down, the line that was heavily circled in red ink. Duty manager, evening cover for Steve's dental appointment. Ian, shift, 1700 to 0200. Ian stared at the paper. The words seemed to physically mock him. A double shift. He was on a Friday double shift. He had survived the flood, the famine, the toddlers, and the structural sausages, only to be immediately thrust into the front line of a Lloyd's No. 1 Friday night. A young man with a haircut that resembled a heavily gelled seagull slammed his hand on the bar directly in front of Ian. "Mate!" the young man yelled over the deafening music, waving a crumpled 20-pound note. "Mate! 4 Jaeger bombs and a pitcher of something blue! Quickly, mate, we're parched!" Ian looked at the young man. He looked at the sea of writhing, dancing bodies rapidly filling his beautiful, tragic, ruined pub. He looked at Roxy, who was currently fist-pumping behind the decks, completely lost to the rhythm. Ian slowly, methodically, reached up and pulled his tie completely off. He tossed it into the damp sink. He smoothed down his wrinkled, short-sleeved shirt. He plastered a smile onto his face that was so wide, so brittle, and so entirely devoid of joy that it could have frightened a shark. "Right away, sir!" Ian screamed back over the music, grabbing a plastic pitcher with a trembling hand. "Welcome to the Sir Lance A. Boyle. Let absolute, unending madness commence." And somewhere, out in the cool, quiet Gloucester evening, Luna the Akita found a perfectly dry patch of grass, curled up into a magnificent fluffy ball, and went soundly to sleep. The author Gordon King has asked me to read this little message to you, the listeners, of this audiobook. Thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this audiobook, and I'm thrilled to let you know that there are plenty more on the way. If you want to listen to more stories just like this one, along with a fantastic collection of full-cast plays and classic old-time radio shows, then please come and join me over on my channel, The Wireless Theatre. We have lots more coming very soon, including a wide variety of different books and genres for you to dive into. Also, if you're looking for your next great listen right now, I'd highly recommend checking out the Ghostwriter series of audiobooks while you're there. They are definitely worth your time. If you enjoyed this experience, please like and subscribe to The Wireless Theatre so you never miss an upload, and, of course, leave a comment and give me any ideas you might have that I can use for a book, or the ideas that you think would be funny in the audiobook. Thank you again for your support, and I'll see you next time.